When Paul wrote his letter to the Colossians, admonishing them to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God, he no doubt had in mind psalms like Psalm 150, which Richard read just a few minutes ago. Psalm 150 mentions songs, and it mentions the instruments that would have been widespread during biblical times. The trumpet, or something that would have been antecedent to the trumpet, probably not a modern trumpet. The lute, the harp, the tambourine, one of the oldest of musical instruments. Did you know that the very first piece of the Bible is a song sung by a woman named Miriam? You'll hear a little more about that in a couple of weeks, to her tambourine. Paul probably may not have known anything about the instrument that we call an organ. After all, this was back 2,000 years ago, right? But the fact of the matter is, it's possible that Paul indeed did know about the organ, because it was actually invented by an Egyptian named Eusebius of Alexandria about 250 years before Jesus was born. Now, I didn't know that, did you? I didn't know that until this week when I started looking up information about the organ. I thought, oh my gosh, I would have thought it was a much more recent invention. But Eusebius, who was a mathematician and a genius, figured out how to harness water energy to make sound move, and he created a keyboard instrument that moved sound waves and made music. And it was a delicate instrument that created a huge sound with a very light touch, according to writings of the time. So it's a very ancient instrument, that precursor to the modern pipe organ that we know. His instrument was called, by the way, a hydraulis. So all those of you who know anything about this know that hydro is water, a water instrument. No water up here, right?
I hope not.
By the 8th century, and initially, where there were a lot of instruments used in the church, apparently the organ was not. It was really more something for entertainment. But by the 8th century, we begin to see the organ used in corporate worship in the early Christian church. And appropriately enough, and I didn't know this before I looked things up this week, the first use of the organ, probably in church music, was for the call to worship, the way it was used this morning. And it would have been a much more elegant affair than we have now, because the call to worship, you listen to what Gary was playing in that time, it was very big music, and what would have been happening at that time is that the priest and others would have been coming in a big processional, and they all would have come into the church. They wouldn't have been sitting here in their pews, you see. In the call to worship, they would have been outside, and the organ would have called them into worship in this huge procession. Somewhere between the 12th and the 17th century, the organ continues to be developed, and it becomes the more modern instrument that we know. Musicians begin writing elaborate music for the organ, taking advantage of all of its abilities. Until the development of the telephone exchange in the late 19th century, the pipe organ was the most advanced instrument of any sort, the most advanced kind of system of any sort, the most advanced man-made article, until the invention of the telephone exchange in the late 19th century, and I didn't know that either. Today, of course, it's hard to even imagine a church service without the sound of the organ in the contemporary mainline Christian church, Catholic and Protestant. There are some that use only piano, there are some that use no music at all, but for us, I think, it's in our bones, isn't it? From the time we were children, the sound of the organ is somehow intertwined with our notion of what church is. It still calls us to worship. There's a reason, I think, that the organ has become sort of the archetypal church musical instrument. It is, in many ways, a really good metaphor for the life of faith. In the languages of the Bible, the words for spirit, wind, and breath are the same words both in Hebrew and in Greek. In Hebrew, the word is ruach, and in Greek, it is pneuma or pneuma. The wind that makes the pipes in a pipe organ sound, and the breath that enables us to sing are both like the Spirit of God that breathes through us, breathes life into us, and empowers us to do what God has given us to do. The organ is like the very breath that we have. This organ that really shares the same meaning with the organs in our body. This instrument that sits up here in front today. I also think it's a really wonderful metaphor for the life of faith in the church. Because if you watched Gary this morning, we normally don't get to see him play. He sits back there in the corner, we don't see him. But if you've ever watched an organist up close, or if you were paying close attention this morning, an organist, unlike some other musicians, uses his entire body to make sound. If you watch what he's doing, every single part of him is engaged in the enterprise of creating music. He's using his hands on these multiple keyboards up here. He's using his feet to create part of the sound as he moves his feet back and forth. His whole body posture has to be engaged. He's using, obviously, his brain, his ears, his eyes. He's using his whole self to create this music that calls us into worship. And isn't that a metaphor? Paul gives us that metaphor for what it means to be part of the Christian community. We call it the body of Christ, and we talk about how important each and every one of us is. And that's embodied in Gary every Sunday when he plays music for us. As I suggested to the children, there's another way in which the organ and organist are a perfect metaphor for life in the Christian life. The organ and organist are very important to our worship life, but they're usually not visible. Gary's usually sitting there out of the way. We hear the music, but we don't pay much attention to what he's doing because our eyes are up here in the center of the church. That seems to me very similar to what Jesus told us how we were supposed to be in the Christian faith. That if we were to be leaders, we were to put ourselves not first but last. Not to make ourselves important, but to make ourselves unimportant. And every Sunday, Gary does that for us in the way that he provides music. The music of the organ also binds us together in harmony. The words that Paul uses, that love binds everything in harmony together. Now, when you stand up on Sunday morning and you sing a hymn, how many of you are standing up total musicians? You read music, you totally know where all the notes are, and you sing with absolute certainty. How many of you is that true for? For all the choir members. But for most of the rest of us, we pick up the hymnal and we hope we know where the notes are going to be, don't we? We don't necessarily read music. We don't necessarily have a great ear. We may not have a wonderful voice, but somehow, with the organ underneath all of that sound, we create something that is beautiful and glorious and worshiping because we are supported by this one who sits back here in the corner playing the music. Now, I got really touched when Gary was playing this morning because that's what music does for me. And I wish I had a hanky up here because this little piece of it makes me feel teary. But in looking at that little bit from Colossians this morning, in the admonishment that Paul gives to his followers, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. I think we don't always necessarily appreciate the gift of the human being that Gary is for this church. Not only a fine musician, but someone who shows up here 2 evenings a week in all kinds of weather after working all day at his day job to make sure that when we're here on Sunday morning, the organ is making a beautiful music. He comes and practices. If I call him and I say, Gary, I need you here for a funeral, I need you here for this special event, the answer is almost always, is it all possible? The answer is yes. He's the first one here on Sunday morning. I'm usually the second. Gary's usually the first. He has the building open, the lights on when I arrive. He's here by about 8:30 on Sunday mornings to prepare for the morning. He's a supporting role, by and large. He supports the choir in the music that they make. He supports the congregation in the music that they make. He cooperates with Jackie to create the music that we have on Sunday. If there are other things needful in the church, quietly and silently, it's often Gary who's done it, provided it, been there when we needed him. Usually without pulling a lot of attention to himself. In all those ways, I think he exemplifies what it means to be a Christian in a very real sense and sincerely. It is my great pleasure and honor this morning to acknowledge you and to give you more to the church.
Just as an aside, the question has been asked of me a couple of times since we found out this was going to happen today. If this is my last Sunday, I don't think so. Best of my knowledge, I will be back next week. I will be back in my office. But thank you, Pastor Kathleen, for the kind words. And for this church for putting up with my quirks. And I know we've had a lot of good times, so I hope we have a lot more. There's a lot more music in this thing.